Hi, my name is Abigail Gragg, and I am a mathematics teacher at a high school in New Jersey in the United States of America. My research is on the effects of multiple levels of intelligences in an Algebra 1 classroom, specifically ninth grade, and specifically within station or small group work. Okay, so if we looked at my poster here, we'd zoom in. Let's just start right at the top. My research question was, does implementing multiple levels of intelligences into every class enhance student achievement in an Algebra 1 classroom? So we're going to go through the different methods, my research, the levels of intelligences that were implemented and how they were implemented. But first, I'd like to start with the introduction of why I chose the study and the goal of the study. So recently, the high school that I teach at has combined a lower level math class with a mid-level math class into one class called a college preparatory class. So with that being said, we have various levels of ability within our mathematics class. I also teach ninth grade, which means that we are getting kids from eighth grade who come from all over the place because we are a public high school. So the purpose of this was to try to meet the needs of every student while also meeting in the middle and teaching them the same criteria just in a different way. So that's what I did. And I wanted to pick a theory or a structure that was sound and was known to work. So I chose Howard Gardner's 8 Levels of Intelligences, and I basically took one of the intelligences a day and implemented and measured it in a station. And the stations typically had about 10 to 12 students, sometimes a little bit less, and every student did get that station each day. So that would mean that there's a total of nearly 22 students in the class. Some were absent some of the days, and that was noted in my research. And my students do follow a block schedule. So in the United States, a block schedule, or let's say specifically New Jersey, a block schedule means that I meet with the kids every other day for an hour and a half. Okay? And so every single class was run in stations, or also known as small group work. And the stations ranged from 2 to 3 stations. There were never more than 2 or 3. We always did stations, no direct instruction. The only time the students were not put into stations were when they were taking tests or assessments, summative assessments specifically. Okay, so to go through Howard Gardner's 8 levels of intelligences, we have interpersonal intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, bodily kinesthetic, mathematical logical, visual spatial, verbal linguistic, naturalistic, and musical. Okay? So interpersonal just means that you work very well with others. You do well going through the problems together. And to measure that, we looked at videos. I gathered worksheets and formative assessments and then measured it on the tests, which I'll go through later on. Intrapersonal is working independently, one-on-one. So you work much better alone. You're able to focus. You don't do well working with others necessarily. Bodily kinesthetic would mean that you work better when you have something tangible to hold and relate the lesson to. So if I was learning about permanent markers or how many permanent markers I can buy when I'm given $15, I'll have a pack of permanent markers and I'll have the $15 and we'll do some type of store simulation where they would be exchanging the money for the permanent markers. Mathematical logical was always implemented because this is a math class. So you'll notice that this wasn't noted as much as other intelligences were since we were doing this every day. But mathematical logical just means you work better with numbers. Okay. Visual spatial means that you can see it. So you are a learner from seeing it, not from writing it down, not from listening, maybe both, but mostly from seeing it done. So a lot of people do well with the math problem when you see the math problem not only written, but also done out ahead of time or the steps written down for you. Okay. Verbal linguistic is speaking. So that would be like talking. So I would go through a problem and talk you through something. Naturalistic means nature. So you do much better when your intelligence is implemented within nature. Okay, that is seen a lot in geometry classes because they do take Pythagorean's theorem, triangles, right triangles, and then musical intelligence, which means that you learn better through music. So the way you do that in math is by implementing a song in the class, playing in the background, where maybe they sang the quadratic formula or whatever the content was. Okay. So moving forward to our methods, we're going to start with our research period, and then I'll explain the graphs at the bottom of this. So the research period was broken up into 3 specific periods. This was a 14-week study, so several weeks, okay? And we basically, I broke this up into 3 research periods because it was how many tests we did within that time frame that we were measuring, okay? So I did test 1 to test 2. I would implement these various levels of intelligences and measure them. And then I would stop that and then look at test 2 to test 3 and then test 3 to test 4. Okay. So the way this was implemented, like I've been saying, is that every class we chose, or I chose, or the students helped me choose an intelligence that was relevant to the content we learned. So then I would implement that. So if I did interpersonal intelligence, that day I was measuring how the students worked together, different cues they had, different things they said, different questions. And then at the end of the class, I would give them a formative assessment. Here we call it an exit slip, which is basically a small card that has a question relevant to what they learned that day. And they had to do it on their own. So I could see if what they learned, or what I wanted them to learn, was what they actually learned. And what I ended up measuring was if them interacting, so the part that they learned when they were interacting was what was on the exit slip. And then I measured that. I collected it and measured it. Okay. And if you look below the implementation, if you pause this video, it tells you how many times each intelligence was implemented into each research period. Okay, they were different. There was always interpersonal and intrapersonal, and always bodily kinesthetic. Okay. So the data collection process, like I said, was analyzed throughout 14 weeks. We kept daily logs. So I every day made a log with a description, who was in the class, the goal of the class. I put in how it related to the research, what the multiple levels of intelligence implemented was, how I implemented it, how I measured it, and whatever I collected that day, I put in a folder and I copied into the log. So eventually when I went to write my results section, I was able to pull all that information and look specifically at how each level of intelligence was affected over time. Okay. I also used video recordings, as I mentioned. There were a lot of formative assessments, a lot of checklists, and a lot of summative assessments. And these summative assessments were all published through Linkit, and we use them directly from the textbook that we use, which is called Savvas Realize, Savvas. It's a great Algebra 1 textbook that we utilize to have sound and accurate assessments. Okay, so here is our results. So part 2 of the video. And throughout the video, throughout the research period, we found 3 different results from the research. So the first one would be that there's no correlation to multiple levels of intelligences that shows that it directly enhanced student achievement. The second is that bodily kinesthetic intelligence is shown to be the most effective out of the 8 on assessments for student outcomes. And the third is that out of all the intelligences, interpersonal intelligence enhanced the student understanding in class the most. So let's go through the first topic with you guys. So I'm just going to zoom in here. So the way that each test period works is that they take a topic test and then they take a performance assessment. So the topic test would be intrapersonal, where they're taking it alone, and the performance assessment would be interpersonal, where they're taking it with a group. Okay, so the topic test alone is the orange line, and the performance assessment is the blue line. So if you notice here, after I took the averages from the baseline data, the first test, the second test, the third test, so test 1, test 2, test 3, which ended up being the second test, the third test, you see that it's kind of sporadic in the averages, where there's no consistent increase and there's no consistent decrease, which shows that there's no direct correlation with all 8 of the intelligences being implemented on student achievement in a math classroom. So if you notice here, I took a bar graph. I took it and made it into a bar graph. On the side here, we have the percentage that they were able to score, so 100, and the lowest would be 0. So again, we have the orange line here, which is the intrapersonal, the topic test. They're taking this alone, standardized test type. They took this on what's called Linkit, which I'll get into on the second and the third finding, and then their performance assessment. So I want you to take note here how the difference, how much higher the performance assessment is, and how much more consistent it is with the one outlier here, because that will be useful for our next topic. Okay, for our third, actually, I'm sorry. So the second finding was that bodily kinesthetic intelligence showed to be the intelligence that had the most improvement on test questions. So once I found out that there's no direct correlation, I wanted to see specifically out of all of the 8 levels of intelligences, which was the most effective. And I was able to do that through the platform that we give our tests on. So this is called Linkit. And basically what happens is that Linkit breaks each question down into the points and how many people answered it correctly. So it's a little hard to see there. Let me see if I can zoom in here a bit for you guys. Okay. So if you notice here for this question, you'd see that there's a possibility of 14 points and 91% of students in this class answered that correctly, which would show that this is a good question, or that whatever was taught that day ended up being received the way we wanted it to be. So what I did was I was able to take the lesson being taught on the day that I implemented the intelligence and measure it to the test question. The way I was able to do this was because since we are block scheduling, we teach one lesson a day. So let's say that we were teaching students how to add and subtract fractions. So on this day, I taught them how to add and subtract fractions, and let's say that I implemented interpersonal intelligence. So we did adding and subtracting fractions, interpersonal intelligence on the same day. I measured it, and then I was able to look when they took the test at the question that had adding and subtracting fractions that correlated with that lesson and saw how the intelligence affected their overall outcome, so their overall scoring and the points within that question. So, for example, on test 2, question 2, let's say that I taught them how to find exponential functions, okay? And I taught that lesson through doing an activity, which I did end up doing this way. You do an activity where you measure your heart rate at a resting rate, then you go run and you measure it again. So that shows an exponential growth. So I did that with them, which is a bodily kinesthetic activity. And then I was able to, a couple weeks later, when we took the test, look at that specific question that related to that content and see how it affected their points. Clearly, for question number 2, they all received it, which means that bodily kinesthetic intelligence was useful. So I did this with all of the intelligences, and out of all of them, bodily kinesthetic had the highest averages. Okay, so you'll see here we have 91%. We even have 100%. We have 100% twice actually, and this was the only intelligence that had 100% accuracy in answering the points correctly out of all of them. We do see 64%, which is a little low, but still not bad, still doing pretty well. Over half of the students are answering it correctly. We do see for question number 6, there is an outlier at 24%. This is the reason because of this is because this question overlapped with another content area, so they combined 2 different contents together. You also might notice that a lot of the students receive 7 points, so if you added those 38 and the 24 up together, that's a pretty high percentage still. Okay, so again, on the test, out of the 8 intelligences, bodily kinesthetic was the most impactful out of 8. So this graph, or this pie chart below, basically just breaks up what I just said. So SAC is the acronym here, so that stands for student answered correctly. SPAC stands for student answered partially correctly, which is the dark blue. And then the orange is students did not answer correctly. Okay, so if you notice here, about 73% of students answered almost all of the bodily kinesthetic questions correctly. And this was created through averaging all of them and then looking specifically within bodily kinesthetic. And I did this for all of the intelligence as well. All right, and you see that 14% did not answer correctly and 13% answered partially correct. Okay. So my final finding was that out of all of the intelligences, interpersonal was the most useful for student improvement and student understanding in the classroom specifically. So Again, once I found out there's no direct correlation, I knew that I was measuring in class and on the test their achievement scores. So I wanted to see in class which ones helped them directly in that lesson better articulate and understand the lesson. So that would be interpersonal intelligence. Okay. And I found that again through averaging all the intelligences and looking at their formative assessments, so their worksheets. So basically, their worksheets, their exit slips. So basically, what I did was I would give them 2 questions on their exit slips. If they got 2 questions correct, they fell into the SBUFI, which is student better understood from intelligence. If they answered partially correct, so they only got 1 out of the 2 questions correctly, it was SN, which is student is neutral. And if they didn't answer either one of those correct, it became student did not understand. Okay, better. So here you'll see that nearly 90%, it is 87.8% to be exact, but nearly 90% of students answered correctly on the days that we did interpersonal intelligence. And I measured it pretty similarly to how I measured it with the second finding, where I basically looked at the intelligence I implemented in the station that day. And then I gave them the exit slip, and the exit slip related to what they learned in the station with the intelligence. Okay. So nearly 90% is a very large amount of the student group as an average to answer correctly. And this shows a great improvement from interpersonal intelligence. Okay, so this is specifically just looking within my logs. I mentioned earlier that I had daily logs that I kept. So here are a few where interpersonal were logged and the scores were written down. Okay, so you'll see daily log number 1, 10, 18, and 26. I took nearly about 30 logs, I believe. And it just shows the student understanding, measured and averaged out. Okay, and so it was pretty high throughout across the board. So now if we move on to our conclusions. So our conclusions are very similar to what we found, or what I found in my research, my findings. So the first one is that overall implementing multiple levels of intelligences into the classroom definitely allows for differentiation, but it can't be something that you solely depend on. You need to use it as a crutch. And it would be more useful, I feel, if the students were organized into their own intelligence that they learn best from, as opposed to just putting them into stations and measuring how each one of them reacted. Okay, so definitely use the multiple levels of intelligences as a crutch, but overall, depending on it to improve student achievement, it may not always do that in an algebra classroom. So again, the second finding is what I found first, bodily kinesthetic. So the two other takeaways from this, and something that I'd like to share with all of you guys, is I do teach math. I have taught different levels of math. And we all know that bodily kinesthetic intelligence does help our students better understand. This research does prove that. And I know it's not always easy to do that in a math classroom, but there's always a way to find bodily kinesthetic intelligence to be implemented into the lesson, and it does show to increase out of all 8 of the intelligence does increase their test scores. So if you need any help with figuring out, if your math teacher need help with figuring out how to implement bodily kinesthetic intelligence into a lesson, please feel free to contact me, and I'll sit and I'll work with you and we can figure it out, because it will help the students overall. And again, interpersonal, so students working together, just like our research shows, and this does follow up and align directly with that, in class intelligence is improved. So students do better understand in class that day when you're teaching through letting them work with other people. It allows them to find the little mistakes. It allows them to hear different ways to teach it. It allows them to hear it from a different, even just a different voice sometimes will help them better understand. So I would highly recommend, throughout this whole research, this is what I found, but I would highly recommend, if you are teaching in a math classroom of any level, implementing bodily kinesthetic lessons and implementing interpersonal intelligence lessons. And if you do stations, these are perfect because you can make one of those stations that intelligence and teach the lesson, and then they go and they practice. So if you'd like any further assistance or have any further questions, please contact me and I would love to help you. Thank you and have a great day.